Silent Hill 4, an entry in the Silent Hill series that would try and deviate from the formula. It would take a new direction and attempt to push the series down a different path. It introduced new gameplay elements and tried to focus on a separate theme. It introduced a new type of horror for the series, not psychological, not overt, but intense horror. But would this game stand up to the others in the series? The last numbered entry in the series would also be the last for Team Silent. Today, we're going to be taking a comprehensive look at Silent Hill 4: The Room. We'll be looking at gameplay, mechanics, story, and everything in between. If you haven't seen my previous videos on the Silent Hill series, it would be a good time to go check them out. Seeing all the games in the series will give you some necessary context for this entry. Spoiler alert for Silent Hill 1, 2, 3, and 4. Hi Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I want to talk about Silent Hill 4: The Room. Development of Silent Hill 4 began alongside Silent Hill 3. The team wanted to take the series in a different direction than the previous games. There's some debate as to the origin of Silent Hill 4 and whether it was originally meant to be a Silent Hill title. There's some evidence for and against, and I don't think it particularly matters in the end. The game was officially announced at Gamers Day in 2004. Akira Yamaoka returned, this time producing the game. The main concept was to take something that's recognized as a safe area and make it a danger zone. A first-person perspective was used in the room to create a claustrophobic feel and make the navigation more personal. In general, the team wanted to take the series in a different direction. They didn't want it to feel like the same old Silent Hill. Now, the team that worked on this game wasn't really the old Team Silent that we knew. At least, most of the influential members had left. There's a really good video on this subject by the Gaming Muse called There Was No Team Silent that really goes over everything. But at this point, the team members had been so switched out that most of the cast responsible for the first two, and even the third game, were gone. Masashi Tsuboyama, the director of Silent Hill 2, would return as art director and monster designer. The drama director of Silent Hill 2, Suguru Murakoshi, would return to direct the fourth entry and write the scenarios. And Shingo Yuri, the character modeler for Silent Hill 2 and 3, would also come back to design the characters for The Room. The two most influential members of the team, Hiroyuki Iwaku and Masahiro Ito, had left at this point. With a lot of newer faces in higher positions and some grand, fresh ideas, what does Silent Hill 4 offer? I want to make my obligatory disclaimers before we get into the game here. I'm playing Silent Hill 4 on the PCSX2 emulator on PC. There is a PC port of Silent Hill 4 available for purchase on GOG, but I couldn't get it working at all, even with multiple fan-made fixes applied. Also, I'll be taking the same story approach that I have with the previous three Silent Hill games. Silent Hill's story, as we know, is pretty in-depth, and a lot of it is hidden behind memos, interesting optional content, and subtext. Because of this, I'll go through my playthrough talking about the gameplay, mechanics, and story, mirroring the average first playthrough of the game. Afterwards, we'll go over what actually happened in Silent Hill 4. Silent Hill 4: The Room starts with some backstory. We learn that our new main character, Henry Townsend, has lived in room 302 of South Ashfield Heights for 2 years. 5 days ago, he began having recurring dreams and couldn't leave his room. Henry gets out of bed and his room is filthy, covered in blood and rust. He sees a face in the wall and something comes out of it, the room changing around him. This was Henry's dream, and he wakes up for real in his apartment. Henry picks up the phone and tries to make a call. It doesn't work, but then the phone rings.
Hello? help me.
What? The cord's cut.
Henry sees a woman outside, standing by the subway entrance, and his front door is covered in locks. It's been chained from the inside, and a message appears on the front from someone named Walter. Henry can experience a lot of things from the inside of his room. He can look out the peephole of his front door, peek out the windows to see the streets outside. The radio will sometimes play, and will even receive memos and messages under his front door. This isn't the only area of the game, though. It's just our central hub. As you can tell, we navigate through it in a first-person view. We'll talk about this more later and why it's so great, but it really does serve to make the experience more personal and claustrophobic. The apartment is small, and having an overhead angle wouldn't illustrate that as much. Outside Harry's front door, we see his neighbor Eileen dropping some cans and getting ready for a party. There's also 15 red handprints suspiciously on the wall behind her. Henry gets a note under his door that reads, "Mom, why doesn't you wake up?" He also finds another note behind his bookshelf. It seems to be an ancient text about the ritual of the Holy Assumption, where a space was built that is separate from our world, a space constantly in flux. Henry hears a loud crash and checks his bathroom to see that a hole has appeared in his wall. He removes a steel pipe from it, our first weapon of the game. There are sounds coming from inside, and Henry crawls through the hole. On the other side, he's in a new world. Subway World. This hole will be our portal to the different levels of the game. Because of this, the room acts as our own safe haven, or hub. We can return here using portals that we find in the game's different levels to regain health or switch items out. Silent Hill 4 makes a lot of gameplay changes, the largest being that we have a limited inventory. There is no more inventory screen, just a 10-slot HUD at the bottom. We can use this to switch out between weapons or use items in the world. Because it's limited, we have to head back to the room to be able to free space if we need it. The game has some interesting uses for this concept, and I think overall it does pretty well, but it takes a little bit too long to get back to the room, store or switch items, and head back. Henry meets a woman down here named Cynthia. She thinks this is all a dream and asks Harry to help her find the exit.
So you think this is a dream, huh?
Well, if it's not a dream, what is it? Anyway, I want to get out of here, but I can't find the exit. Say, will you help me find it?
She promises him a special favor if he does. Shortly after this, Cynthia gets sick and heads into the bathroom. Waiting for her, we're introduced to the first enemies of the game, the Sniffers. They're dogs, pretty reminiscent of the others we've seen in the series. These ones are green, though, with long tongues and suck the blood of their enemies. Heading inside the bathroom, Cynthia is nowhere to be found, but we get our first portal to head back to the apartment. Henry thinks this must have been another dream, and we're introduced to some more apartment-related mechanics. Silent Hill 4's story is fantastic in not only its concept, but its delivery of said story. When heading back to the apartment to change weapons or items, we'll also find other things that have been changed. Here, Henry's dresser has been moved, and beside it is a pistol. There's a strange note and a tunnel next to it. The note describes trying to make a tunnel to the next apartment, but not being able to get any further. There's a small peephole, and Henry can look through to his neighbor Eileen's bedroom. Henry also gets a phone call. It's Cynthia, and she wants us to save her. The room acting as a calm area to slow things down and look over new information is great. It gives us a chance to breathe and to decompress. We can also think about everything we've learned here. When we receive a new memo or a new piece of information, we can analyze it. And this is what Silent Hill is all about, constructing a narrative out of different bits of information. The room becomes something else later in the game, but we'll get to that. Heading back to the subway station, there seems to be a Cynthia mannequin in the stall, and she's holding a token. The token will allow us to access the Lynch Street station. Here, we're introduced to another of Silent Hill 4's brand new enemies. These ones are a little different than the other enemies in the game. They crawl out of the walls and float above the ground. They damage Henry even when they're just close, but they can also attack. They can't actually be killed, only disabled. To do this, you have to stop them with a silver bullet or down them and use a sword of obedience, which will pin them to the ground. The only thing is, there's not many swords or silver bullets in the game, so they're best just avoided. I don't really mind this new mechanic, and it's actually a pretty interesting idea. There's a permanence to some of the enemies in that they can't just be killed, you have to deal with them. My biggest problem with the ghosts will come later in the game, but we'll get to that as well. Honestly, a lot of my problems with Silent Hill 4 only arise after the halfway point, because before that, the game is spectacular. Henry makes his way to the train and finds Cynthia locked inside one of the cars. He gets her out and she follows us, the two weaving through subway cars to get to the other side. We find a room with a portal, but Cynthia doesn't follow us inside. Heading to the King Street station, we'll hear Cynthia calling us to the turnstiles. She's found the exit. We have to head up the escalator here and avoid some extremely annoying wallmen. These guys push themselves out of the wall and swat at Henry. The only way to get around them is to time your runs well, or hit them. When we reach the turnstiles, we see Cynthia's makeup scattered across the ground. The door to the control room has a temptation placard on it that we receive when entering. Inside, Cynthia has been brutally murdered.
It's just a dream, right? I think I drank too much last night. I never got to do that special favor for you.
There's numbers carved on her chest here, 16121. Henry closes her eyes and he's back in his room. As he wakes up, he realizes this couldn't be a dream, because outside his window, there's an ambulance and detectives at the subway entrance. Slipped under Henry's door is a red piece of paper referencing the cult, and I think you know which cult it's talking about. The author believes the cult is still alive. When we enter the bathroom, the hole has grown much bigger, and Henry climbs inside yet again. This time, we aren't at the subway station, but a new world, the forest world. This place is a tree-filled area, intertwined with factory settings, and directly in the center, the Wish House. If you've seen my video on Silent Hill 3, you'll remember that the Wish House was an orphanage outside of Silent Hill. Henry heads through the forest and discovers a running car with a diary inside. A man named Jasper has just arrived, and he's looking to meet the devil in Silent Hill. He also has a piece of paper that says, if you bring the dug-up key, you can't go back, whatever that means. We see Jasper just up ahead, and he tells us about the stone he's sitting beside. The Native Americans in the area used to call it the Nakihona, and it let them talk to their ancestors.
They're just up ahead in that weird building, operating some kind of crazy religious cult. They used to collect orphans and did things to them.
Once in the Wish House compound, we head back to the apartment. Eileen is outside the front door, and even though Henry pounds and screams, no one can hear him. Eileen and another neighbor talk about the apartment, thinking there's something strange going on in there. They head off to call the superintendent, and another red handprint has been added to the wall. Strange. Henry heads back to the compound to find the Wish House locked. Henry makes his way through the surrounding forests and finds a boy lost in the woods.
You're finally the third revelation. Something's gonna happen. That nosy guy that was here, he said it too. Something big is gonna happen. Finally, it's gonna happen!
Jasper is standing back at the Wish House, and he has a spade that we need, but he's thirsty. We have to head back to the apartment and grab some chocolate milk from the fridge and give it to him. The spade tells us where to dig, and we head there. We find the key to the wish house, but if you remember, we can't head back with the key. We have to stash the key in Henry's apartment to be able to return to the house, and then grab the key again and use it on the wish house. This implementation of the room is really good, and is definitely the upside of the new mechanic. It's an inventive use of something new, and really makes it stand out. Inside the wish house, we find some cult literature detailing more scriptures. We hear screams coming from a room inside, and grab another placard from the door, the source placard. Inside the room, Jasper has been set on fire and is burned alive, while Henry is forced to watch. He has numbers carved on his chest, just like Cynthia did. The performances in this game are pretty fantastic, and in my opinion are up there with some of the best of Silent Hill. They can be pretty terrifying and unnerving, and not in the way it's been previously. Silent Hill 2 was more disconnected unnerving, but these are more traditionally horrifying. They're a little more straightforward in this game, and I think that brings a believability to it that can make the horrors more genuine. As Henry wakes up, he hears a news report of someone being killed with numbers carved into their body.
A special news report. In a forest near Silent Hill, the burned corpse of a 30-year-old male was discovered earlier today. The police have ruled it a homicide and are investigating. The numbers 17121 were reportedly carved into the man's body. Due to the marks on the victim, the police are investigating possible links to the Walter Sullivan case 10 years ago.
If you remember, Walter Sullivan was mentioned briefly in a Silent Hill 2 memo, having murdered multiple people in the town. Henry sees the superintendent knocking at his door, and Henry is trying to scream for help, but the man can't hear him.
Are you in there, Henry?
Help me! There's something wrong with this room! Help! Let me out of here!
Is anybody home?
He tries to unlock the door, but can't get it open. The superintendent thought he heard something, but he can't be sure, and leaves. There's another faint handprint added to the wall. Henry heads back into the bathroom, the hole in his wall having grown larger yet again, and climbs inside. Henry wakes up in Water Prison World. He hears a man begging to be let out of his cell, but Henry can't free him. We find a memo on the ground giving us some hints about the building. We're in the first level cell block currently, and the prison is laid out in a very strange way. It's a cylindrical tower with 8 cells on each floor. In the center, past the cells, is an observation room where the prisoners can be monitored from. Floors 2 and 3 can also be moved around, changing the orientation of the cells. We need to get to this surveillance room and change the orientation of the rooms, but it's kind of a process. Henry heads back to the apartment and finds another red diary letter under his door. The letter is from a journalist that's been investigating the murders of Walter Sullivan. He had carved numbers into his victims, 10 people in 10 days. The interesting thing about this note is that it says the murders took place 7 years ago, but we just heard from the news report that they took place 10 years ago. Odd. Henry heads back to the prison and makes his way inside, finding a strangely large door and a water wheel. The water wheel controls the lights in the building, so we need to get it running from the roof. I haven't really talked about combat too much yet, Dad, so I'm going to do that now. The combat in Silent Hill 4 is interesting, and I'll get in depth with my complaints later, but there are a lot of items in this game, especially weapons. A lot of weapons can break, in particular the golf clubs. We find a ton of golf clubs throughout the game. They're powerful, but break easily. Some weapons, like the pickaxe, are slow, but do a ridiculous amount of damage. Then there's the ranged weapons. We find tons of ammo for the pistol, but it still isn't really useful. It's a little powerful, but we can't stack the ammo, so it ends up taking up valuable inventory space. This renders most of the ranged weapons useless outside of dealing with ghosts. On top of that, most enemies are particularly punishing, which makes running away from them almost pointless. You're forced to deal with the enemies you're fighting because juking them is just sometimes not an option. I don't really like this change too much as it forces you into combat, and after you've killed an enemy 30 times, it reduces them in your mind. They aren't these powerful, terrifying beings anymore, it's just another dog. We turn the water on from the roof and head to the 3rd floor, where we meet our first twin victim. This is a new enemy type, and I do think the designs of enemies in this game are a strong point. The twin victim is a pair of lumbering, conjoined children walking on massive arms, a cloak draped around its head. It's pretty terrifying to look at, and its quick movements make it unpredictable and terrifying. But it faces the same problem as everything else, and really the problem with this game overall. Once you defeat one enough times, you stop looking at it as a horrifying monster, and more as a gameplay element. Henry finds some holes in the prison cells and jumps down. This allows us to access the surveillance room and control the floor orientation. We find some memos here that tell us how to orient the floors so that the holes are aligned and we can get down into the kitchen. We also find the door code for the kitchen and rotate the floors accordingly. As Henry moves the floors, we see the man from the cell earlier freed. Heading downstairs, he's talking to the boy that we saw in the forests outside the wish house. We can barely hear what he's saying, but it seems like he's begging the boy.
Who is that boy? And who are you?
His name's Walter. Walter Sullivan. I used to work at the orphanage watching the kids. I'm Andrew DeSalvo.
Walter was very indoctrinated into the cult, and Andrew is terrified of him. After this, Henry jumps through the holes in the prison and finds his way into the kitchen. On the door is the watchfulness placard. Inside, Andrew has been killed, and numbers have been carved into his body. You should be recognizing a pattern at this point. Henry wakes up to find his bathroom covered in blood, and strange noises are coming from the hole. Outside his front door, Eileen and the superintendent are talking about how to get the door open. The superintendent thinks that the apartment building is cursed because this same thing happened with the previous tenant. Before he slides a note under the door, he makes a strange remark to Eileen.
Don't worry about it too much. There are a lot of strange things in this world. The umbilical cord I keep in a box in my room. Lately it's started to smell terrible.
The note gets to us, but it's covered in blood and we can't read it. Another red piece of paper tells us about the power of swords of obedience, the weapons that can pin down ghosts. We head back into the hole for another world, Building World. Heading down the alleys, we're introduced to the gumhead enemy, very reminiscent of the rompers from Silent Hill 1.
Ouch!
A man falls from the building above and miraculously is fine. He's Henry's neighbor, Richard, and they're both wondering what's going on. We find out that the author of the diary we've been reading from under the door lived in Henry's apartment before him. He went crazy and shut himself inside.
Wait. Watch out for that kid.
Henry makes his way through the building world and heads back to his apartment. Through the peephole, we can see a message in blood. In Building World, we can venture through different stores and even find an elevator. On the next one over, we can see Richard threatening Walter, thinking he knows what's happening with the apartment.
You live in that apartment too, huh? Say, you look a lot like a little punk that I once caught sneaking around there. Do you know something about what's going on? Hey!
Inside of a bar, Henry finds a locked door. A memo close by says that the code is the last 4 digits of the bar's phone number, which happens to be on a billboard outside. If we head back to the apartment, we can see the billboard and get the code. Through here, Henry follows a staircase up, a ghost chasing him close behind. At the top, we receive the Chaos placard, and inside, Richard is being electrocuted, numbers carved into his forehead. Walter is standing close by, watching out a window before he disappears. Back in the apartment, we can hear the police transmissions on our radio, talking about the newest death.
Case from 10 years ago. Yeah, that Walter Sullivan case. But Sullivan's dead. They even got the body.
In the building across the street, we can see a man pointing at our neighbor's apartment. Not Richard, but Eileen. If we look through her peephole, we can see that she's getting ready for the party. Henry heads into the hole and ends up in apartment world. We see a man in a coat knocking on Eileen's door before walking away. We're just outside our apartment now, but of course our door is locked. Inside one of the apartments, the one on the other side of us, actually, has some diaries written by the tenant. Mike lived here, and he thought that the journalist, Joseph, who lived next door, was going crazy. We find some keys and an article, the exact same article from Silent Hill 3, about the Wish House, written by none other than Joseph Schreiber, the previous tenant of room 302. Inside the apartment, the laundry room has gone bloody, and the man in the coat is staring at us through the peephole. Another diary entry from Joseph has figured out the numbers on the bodies. They are numbers out of 21, meaning Walter Sullivan planned to kill 21 people, but only made it to 10. Originally, anyways. We head back to the apartment world and see an apparition of the boy version of Walter knocking on our apartment door, asking for his mom. We see the man in the coat sitting alone on the stairs. He leaves us the doll, and we have the option to take it. Heading through the apartment, we find the superintendent's room. He has keys for the entire building here, and a journal. This explains a little further what he meant by that strange statement earlier. 30 years ago, a couple left their child in room 302, and the superintendent kept the umbilical cord after the ambulance took the child away. It should be noted that the superintendent's name is Frank Sunderland, and is the father of James Sunderland of Silent Hill 2. At this point in the game, there are a ton of items that we can pick up, whether optional or necessary. Picking up health items and weapons is pretty important because, like I said before, the enemies can be pretty punishing. The only downside to this is the inventory system. Because we can only carry so much, we have to keep going back and placing things in the chest. Either you take the time to go back, or you forego the optional items and try to make it without. This isn't necessarily a bad choice, but it just feels like it takes extra time away from the game and the story itself to go do inventory management. Among the various apartments, we find one that has a stockpile of weapons. All weapons that have been featured in the series so far, to be exact. But they're just models, so we can't use them. We find an artist's room who's been painting the different tenants of the building. He painted one tenant who said he had recorded another tenant, Mike, being skinned alive. We find this tape in another room along with a revolver. Journeying through the rooms, we'll find multiple blank pieces of red paper. We can slip these under the door to room 302 and head back to the apartment to gather them. 4 of the notes are from Joseph's diary, and he's wondering how Walter could have been back to kill another victim if he's already been dead. Joseph also talks about how he found the key to Eileen's room, but lost it in his room the other day. We find the key inside room 302, beside the bed. The last note is from Mike to Rachel, a nurse who he was in a love triangle with in the building. Rachel also happens to be the nurse from Silent Hill 2, the one that took care of Mary Sunderland. Henry grabs the key to Eileen's room and listens to the skinned Mike cassette.
How do you like that, you sick little freak? You had it coming to you. These clothes are disgusting. Get them out of my sight.
I know. It'll be perfect to wrap his body in.
Heading back to the apartment world, we can unlock Eileen's room, but Walter is standing over her. She has numbers carved into her back and blood all around her.
Hey, kid. Thanks. Did you find your mommy? This place? It's dangerous. You need to hurry. Get out of here.
Henry collapses, having failed to rescue yet another person. Waking back up in his apartment, he sees the ambulance leaving the apartment building. A note from Joseph's diary says that he sealed the storage room in the back to protect himself. Going into the washroom, the hole in the bathroom has been closed up. We find a succubus talisman under the door and can use it on the newly appeared mark in the laundry room. 4 indentations take shape, and a bloody note on the wall gives us more of the cult's scripture. We can place the placards that we've gathered in their indentations, and a new hole will appear. Henry climbs in, and we're in a hospital. The man in the coat currently has his hands inside of a corpse's chest. He chases Henry as he rushes out of the room. We face a new, quite terrifying enemy here, the patient. They're tall, stalking beasts, monsters stitched together from body parts. They are particularly scary to look at, but all that kind of goes away when you hear the sound they make when you hit them. Henry finds a board with all of Eileen's injuries on it, documentations of her attack. He's wondering if she's still alive. Henry finds her bag and heads upstairs. We're introduced to another enemy here, the wheelchairs. They're incredibly annoying because they drive at you and turn seemingly at random. When they do this, they knock you down, and you can only disable them. This long corridor is interesting, though. In here is one locked door, Eileen's room. We have to find the key in one of these rooms, and there's a ton of them. The location of each room is actually randomly generated, so no room's ever exactly in the same place. There's a lot of horrifying sights in these rooms, like a strange sterilized room, a skin bed with white knives sticking out of it, a sheet hanging with a person underneath, and, most terrifying of all, a giant Eileen head with eyes bouncing around. When we find the key, we enter Eileen's room. She's sleeping, and Henry startles her, causing her to flash back to when she was attacked.
Eileen, relax!
Henry tells Eileen if she dies here, she'll die in the real world too, and Eileen asks Henry to take her through the hole with him. Henry heads back into the hole, but Eileen doesn't make it through. He's in his apartment alone. We find a note from Joseph telling us to find a door and keep going down to the deepest part of him. Henry finds a memo sticking out from behind his bookshelf. It's also from Joseph, and it says that Walter did die in his prison cell. 3 years after, they found the 12th victim, but there was no 11th. But not all of the things added up, because the 12th victim still had its heart, and Walter's MO was tearing victims' hearts from their chests. He wants to head to Silent Hill to see Walter's grave himself. We find the note Walter writes about heading to Silent Hill. He said there was no body in the grave, and on the coffin, 11 out of 21 was engraved, meaning Walter himself was the 11th victim. We head back into the hospital world, and Eileen is there, saying she didn't see a hole and just saw Henry disappear. She claims we can't just leave her in this world or she'll become cursed.
I can't stay here by myself. I'll be cursed. I know it. What am I gonna do?
I might know a way to save you. Do you know about someone named Joseph?
He was the guy who lived in your apartment before you. I think he was a journalist or something. He disappeared about 6 months before you moved in.
So, Eileen is going to follow us for the rest of the game. This point in the game is where I'm about to start complaining a lot about it, because this turn is where everything really starts to fall apart. Eileen is very slow. She follows us around, and we have to make sure she stays close. We can't just run to the door to the next room, because if she's not close enough, she'll just stay in the previous area. If we leave her in the previous area, she can become cursed, which will make her even slower, and also fall down pretty often, causing us to have to wait for her to get back up before we can continue on. If Eileen becomes cursed, then it will also affect which ending we get at the end of the game. She can't really die, so it's not too big of a deal, but leaving her entirely isn't optional because we can't pass on to the next world unless she's with us. I understand the concept here, one that's similar to Maria in Silent Hill 2. Depending on how you care for or act towards Eileen will affect the end of the game. I liked that implementation in the second game, but here it's more arduous than it is inventive. That's not all that makes this implementation bad. There's another mechanic that's introduced later that takes the whole thing even further, but I'll get to that in a moment. With Eileen, Henry heads through the hospital and reaches a foggy staircase. This takes him down to another door with the cult symbol on it. This will take us into the next world, as we're about to return to each one of the previous ones we've visited. Heading through the door, we're back in Subway World. We head back to the apartment and find a diary entry from Joseph that explains two new items, the Holy Candle and the Saint Medallion. The Holy Candle has the ability to clear curses or hauntings. We can use it on Eileen to get her back up when she's downed, which clears her curse temporarily. The Saint Medallion will ward off ghosts when equipped, causing them to not do area damage to Henry. We also receive a note written by a child to his mother with a toy key inside. Inside the Subway World, a ghost appears from the ground, long black hair floating towards us. This is the ghost of Cynthia. In each revisit of the worlds, we will be haunted by the ghost of the victim that was killed there. These can be particularly annoying because they will follow us through different areas of the whole world if we don't pin them down. So, if you're without a sword of obedience or a silver bullet, you just have to deal with it. Heading through the station, we find a child's toy box in one of the cars and use the toy key on it. From this, we get the filthy coin. We can wash it off back in the apartment and use it on a vending machine in the subway to retrieve a key. Using the key, we can head back to where Cynthia was killed and gain the train handle. This will let us control the train in King Street Station. Once we move it, we gain access to another area, and the man in the coat is behind us, ready to attack. We run from him and head into the door ahead, taking us to another winding ramp. At the bottom, we're back in the forest world. We gain a torch that we can light using the holy flames around the place. So, now is where that second annoying thing comes into play. Walter is now also going to join the little train and follow us for the rest of the game. Only he's not here to be taken care of, he's here to fight. Walter will chase us through certain areas, and he's pretty fast. He has a steel pipe and a gun. When we're out of hand's reach, he'll shoot, and when we're close, he'll swing. He also can't be killed. He can only be downed briefly, and to do that, you have to deal a lot of damage to him. But this won't stop him forever. Now, the Eileen thing isn't so bad on its own. It makes sense why they would put it in the game, and it's a mechanic that can be definitely dealt with if you have to. Walter chasing you also makes sense. It adds to the intensity of the experience. But when these two decisions come together, it's just so bad. It's pretty rough to have to deal with Walter chasing you and trying to move fast enough to get away from him, while also moving slow enough to keep Eileen close to you so you can take her to the next area. The worst thing about this, though, isn't the mechanics themselves being meshed together where they don't belong. It's the fact that it kind of ruins the otherwise pretty great horror that the game was developing. Horror is, in my opinion, probably one of the hardest game genres to get right. It requires the audience to be willing to fool themselves into thinking they aren't playing a video game. Once that illusion is worn off, it's not nearly as scary. All of these things, having to think about Eileen and whether she's close, dealing with normal enemies in the area, and trying to get out of Walter's grasp, serves to break the horror game illusion. Suddenly you're focusing on mechanics and not the terrifying world around you. Eileen and Henry make it back to the Wish House compound. Inside, the place has been burned down after the fire with Jasper. There's a doll torso here in a wheelchair, and our goal is to find all 5 pieces of the doll scattered around the forest and place it back in the wheelchair. We can do this by lighting our torch at the holy flames and using it to look inside of various wells. The torch will go out after time, another thing we have to manage, which we can extend by using the kerosene in the apartment to soak the torch. In a new diary entry, Joseph theorizes that Walter never died in prison, and the man in the coat is the real Walter Sullivan. We find young Walter standing at some sort of monument. He says he's never met his mom or dad, and they left the apartment building after he was born.
But soon I'll get to see my mom.
Do you know where she is now?
Yeah, of course. Right where I was born. Lots of people tried to stop me, but it's fine now. It says in the scriptures that I'll be with her. I gotta hurry. Mom's waiting.
We pick up a medallion from the grave that has the cult's symbol on it. Back in the apartment, hauntings have begun. When we return, there's a chance that things in the apartment will start moving, shaking. We can even hear children's cries inside the room. We encounter Jasper's flaming ghost in the forest by the sacred rock and head back to the wish house to return the final doll piece. When it's placed, the doll moves and reveals a hole. Eileen and Henry crawl inside, and there's a cult altar below. There's another scripture from the 21 Sacraments down here. Placing the crested medallion into the door takes us to another winding ramp. At a certain point in the game, health items become crucial because the room stops healing you when you return. You're forced to only use health items to regenerate health, which is a little problematic because of the fact that the game can be so punishing. I don't think it's ridiculously hard overall, but it plays more into the breaking of the horror illusion that I was talking about before. Heading into the door, we're back in the water prison world, on top of the roof. Walter is here to greet us and we make a run for it. We head down the same holes as before to get back into the kitchen. Where we found Andrew dead before, a prisoner shirt is lying on the ground. There's something written on it in wax, and to read it, we have to soak it back in the apartment. The message says that the fat guy took the key to the basement. Andrew is here, a ghost now, and we're forced to take him down. I didn't have any silver bullets at this point, so I was kind of screwed. You have to take Andrew down with weapons. He takes a lot of damage and doles it out as well. Once he's down, we can stick him with a sword of obedience and take the basement key. Back in the apartment, Joseph's diary starts to summarize everything about Walter, his living in Wish House, his obsession with the apartment as a young boy, and his assumption that room 302 itself was his real mother. The area in the basement that held the large door before now holds a small one and 6 twin victims. We dispense with them and head into another winding ramp. At the bottom, we're in Building World, and Richard's ghost is ready for us right away. This was the most terrifying ghost for me because his movements are erratic. He jumps all over the place, almost like he's glitching, and if you hit him, he jumps behind you. We find a note from an author reminiscing on 4 different memories: his birthday, a cat, sports balls in a basket, and billiards. We have to find 4 items around the world and return them to their places. Henry sees Walter speaking to young Walter.
I'm going to see my mom. Stay out of my way. Who are you, anyway?
My name's Walter. Walter Sullivan. It's time to complete the 21 Sacraments.
But that's my name. And what are the 21 Sacraments?
Don't worry. You'll know soon enough. Well, let's go and see Mother.
We find the volleyball, pool ball, stuffed cat, and birthday candles, and Henry places them in their respective spots. This allows us to use an inverted room to return to the hyper-long staircase. This time, though, it's going down. Entering into the room, we see bodies in platforms falling down to the ground. This is the first of 2 bosses in the game, called the One Truth. There are 12 large wall men in this room that rise up and fall down repeatedly, attacking. We have to find the real one because the other 11 are fake and won't take damage. Attacking the real wall man will cause all the others to flinch. Once they're dead, we head through the door and find another winding ramp. Back in the apartment is another note from Joseph listing out the victims of Walter Sullivan. Eileen and Henry's names last. The door at the bottom of the winding path has the superintendent's journal detailing a dream he had of Walter. The door at the bottom also has 302 on it. This version of 302 is of the past, though. There's a picture book in the living room telling a terrifying story about a child and his mother. A crimson tome sits beside it, a scripture detailing the holy sacraments as blasphemy and telling us how to stop it. In the bedroom, red pieces of paper are scattered all over the place, a typewriter on the desk. They are mostly scattered thoughts on how to defeat Walter and what has been happening to the room. Something strange sits on the ceiling and tells Henry and Eileen about Walter Sullivan.
Let me tell you something about him. Walter Sullivan. When he was a little boy, he began to believe that my apartment was actually his birth mother. He decided to free her from the stains and corruption of this world. At the orphanage, he learned of the 21 sacraments, the only way to purify her. He then performed the ceremony of the Holy Assumption and created this twisted world.
He tells us that it isn't too late and to follow the instructions in the Crimson Tome to stop Walter. He tells us Eileen is being taken over and we have to kill Walter.
It must be nearby. You must kill him. You must kill him. Kill. Kill. Kill.
We find the pickaxe of hope jammed in the back wall of the apartment, and heading back to the real apartment, we can use it on the wall. Inside, Henry finds Walter's body crucified. Inside his coat are the keys of liberation. The keys allow us to finally take the locks off the front door and head outside. The real world is starting to look just like Walter's created one. We have to get into the superintendent's room, but it's covered in chains. Finding 6 hanging bodies around the building will dispel these chains. Just about every victim ghost we've encountered is in this place, along with tons of bodies. The music changes, a melancholic track piercing through the background, and we can hear the voices of Walter's parents overhead. Eileen finds a journal and starts to feel Walter's pain, noticing Walter pushing through. Eileen begins to show sympathy for young Walter and decides that she has to help him. In the super's room, we find the box with the umbilical cord, and Henry begins to writhe in pain. Eileen decides to leave us. She's been fully taken over at this point. Henry takes the umbilical cord and has a strange vision in the hallway. We have to make it back to room 302, and we have one final letter from Joseph. He says that he's leaving everything to the next tenant. He passes on 3 pieces of information. When the bell tolls, the ritual begins. Eileen is the mother's body or blood, and part of the mother's flesh is the super's room. We find that Walter's body is gone, and there's a hole underneath where he was. Henry heads down and finds himself in a red room with a hole in the center. He heads into the door and sees a strange rotating object, Walter standing beside. A strange beast is hanging from the ceiling, and Eileen is on a raised platform. Walter welcomes us, and we begin the final boss battle.
Hey there, little Walter. Just a little longer now.
Of the 21 sacraments. The final sign. The receiver of wisdom.
This battle is incredibly well done and interesting. It takes the ritual battles from the previous games that included them and steps them up a notch. The game has been hinting towards this the entire time, giving us little bits of information that will help us later, but not exactly holding our hand. First things first, Eileen is possessed, and she's slowly moving towards the machine in the center. If Eileen reaches the machine, she dies. That doesn't mean game over for us, but it will affect the ending that we receive. The better we took care of Eileen throughout the playthrough will determine how fast she moves towards the machine. Our goal is to kill Walter, or at least the Walter that we've seen. Walter's true body is the big creature above us. We have to use the umbilical cord on the true Walter, which then unlocks the 8 spears around the room. We're then allowed to use the spears, which can be pulled from the blocks and used on Walter's true body. Once this is complete, we can damage Walter. Walter takes a lot of damage and does a lot of damage as well. We have to take the time to whack at him and take him down. Before he dies, Walter calls for his mother, and his true body begins to collapse. We see the young Walter knocking on room 302's door before collapsing and disappearing. The door to 302 opens, and Henry is seen walking out of the apartment building. The next day, he meets Eileen in the hospital, and they talk about moving away.
Thanks. Guess I'll have to find a new place to live, huh?
This is just the escape ending, though. There are 4 different endings in Silent Hill 4. The ending structure is very similar to that of the first Silent Hill. There are 2 factors that affect endings. The first is Eileen's fate in the final battle, and the second is the amount of hauntings cleared in the apartment. The escape ending is achieved by saving Eileen and clearing most of the hauntings in room 302. The mother ending is achieved if you save Eileen, but do not clear most of the hauntings in the apartment. This is very similar, except that Eileen says she can now go back to the apartment building, and we see the otherworld version of the room before the game ends. Eileen's death is pretty self-explanatory, and can be achieved if most of the hauntings are cleared, but Eileen is not saved in the final battle. This ending sees Harry waking up in the room again and hearing a news report on the radio about Eileen dying in the hospital. The 21 Sacraments ending can be achieved if most of the hauntings are not cleared and Eileen is not saved. This sees Walter returning to the room, and we hear a news report about Henry's death, along with a lot of other people, signifying the ritual complete. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of evidence to determine a canon ending for Silent Hill 4. We could make some deductions based on later games in the series, but I think we can safely assume it's one of the ones where Walter doesn't win. There aren't many extras in the game outside of a chainsaw, submachine gun for Eileen, and some extra costumes. So, what really happened in Silent Hill 4? The story starts with Walter, because the game really is all about Walter. Walter was born in room 302. He was an unwanted child and was abandoned by his mother and father. Frank Sunderland, the superintendent of the building, found Walter in the apartment. Walter was then taken to the Wish House, an orphanage that the cult of Silent Hill used to brainwash children. Dahlia Gillespie convinced Walter that his mother was in room 302, and he was made to believe that his mother could be brought back by completing the ritual of the 21 Sacraments. The ritual wasn't really going to bring Walter's mother back, though. It would actually bring about the descent of the Holy Mother. The ritual itself is meant to kill 21 people. Walter kills himself, but is only separated from his body and is able to continue his work after death. We're then up to the events of the game. Henry Townsend wakes up in his apartment and is trapped. 10 days later, the Hole appears, and Henry uses it to travel to various worlds that are meaningful locations in Walter's life. Walter created these worlds through the ritual of the Holy Assumption. Each of these are reflections of Walter's subconscious. Walter's to-be murders are pulled toward the world of his subconscious so he can effectively kill them, taking another step toward the ritual. Walter hunts his last victims, Eileen and Henry. Henry is assisted by Joseph Schreiber and his actual ghost, which we see near the end of the game. He does the mental heavy lifting by finding out the ins and outs of the ritual, the usage of Eileen and the umbilical cord. Walter's ritual, though, is left up to interpretation. Silent Hill 4 has some truly amazing ideas. The story, in my opinion, is very good and has such an interesting design. To be honest, this game is the one that I remember the most fondly as a kid. I would watch my dad or sister play it on the PS2 and was so freaked out by crawling through the hole, the crazy noises coming from the CRT speakers. Having the game centered around another character than the one you're playing is interesting. I love the idea of focusing the game on Walter and really having it be a game about him. He's truly another victim of the cult, and it's hard to see his past and subconscious haunting him. The wish house, an isolated orphanage, the prison, a representation of indoctrination, the subway, a through line to another world, trying to see his mother. The city, a starkly terrifying place for a child, and the apartment building, a hellish atmosphere with one shining ray of white light. The entire game is viewed through the lens of Walter, and we're getting inside his head, trying to figure out his motives and his final plan. This sword is double-edged, though. Because of this, it feels like Henry really isn't a character at all, but just someone thrown into this whole journey. He doesn't really seem to have opinions, a motive, or even really care about what's going on. He rarely talks for most of the game and just seems generally bewildered. Even most of the victims that we only see for short periods are more interesting than him. The game itself is built around the idea of isolation. Being locked in a room and not being able to get out, playing the role of the observer in the real world. Henry is forced to constantly watch the deaths of others and only be powerless to stop it. This is such a great fear to play on for a horror game because it's one that most people can relate to. The worlds themselves are interesting and well made, and the first half of the game feels like you're running the gambit on a ton of new and interesting places. You feel like you don't know what's going to come next, and things are just flowing incredibly fast. The pace is insane and great. The gameplay changes themselves are also interesting. It's incredibly clear that Team Silent wanted to do something different. They described the game itself as change. The new inventory system, the room itself, watching everything unfold around you, heading to other worlds through the portals, using the room to solve puzzles, getting memos under the door, and being slowly drip-fed an interesting and intriguing story. But unfortunately, that really only explains my feelings on Silent Hill 4's first half. It's incredibly disappointing that this game turns out the way that it does because the beginning is so incredibly promising. It has some built-in downsides, like the time it takes to travel back to room 302 and the inventory system in general, but the rest of it feels new, fresh, and like an interesting direction for the series to go down. On top of that, the game is terrifying to boot. Its style has changed while still maintaining that Silent Hill feel. The sound design is grating and scary, but it's also something else. Silent Hill was a new type of horror for the time. Silent Hill 2 was veering away, focusing on the psychological. Silent Hill 3 was violent and in your face. And Silent Hill 4 is an intense horror. Because the game is naturally punishing, getting away from enemies feels like a necessity. Running and catching your bearings is a must, and it's heart-pumping when a pack of sniffer dogs are chasing you, or a ghost is following you down a path that leads to a dead end. But this intensity and punishment is a fine line. As I said before, when you take this too far, the veil is lifted, and you realize that you're no longer having an experience, you're playing a video game. With the introduction of Eileen and Walter past the halfway point, the veil isn't lifted, it's gone. It's hard to be scared of anything when you're thinking about losing progress or having to redo parts of the level. Top it all off with the fact that you stop receiving healing from the room and your inventory is shortened, causing you to use less healing items or weapons, and you have a culmination of frustrating things in a game that should not be frustrating you. It should be scaring, intriguing, and making you think. Silent Hill 4 genuinely feels like a bundle of really good ideas that don't work well together. Keeping the normal Silent Hill inventory system, keeping the room as a safe haven throughout the game, even though it would have removed one of the theses of the game, and maybe toning back the enemies a little bit would have made this an incredibly enjoyable experience. Oddly enough, I think Team Silent was just trying too much here all at once, and it just doesn't really work together. I love mustard and jelly, but I don't want them both in one sandwich. And it really is a shame because Silent Hill 4 has genuinely some of the best ideas in the entire series, and I think it could have been something really special. Overall, I can't really say if I loved or hated Silent Hill 4. It probably lies somewhere in between because I love and hate this game at the same time. For all of its fantastic, new, interesting ideas, it has more that frustrate and put barriers up between the player and the story. Critics praised the game's atmosphere and general feel, but pointed out the clunky gameplay choices as a downside. After the game released, Team Silent would officially disband after Konami had decided that Western developers should continue to make the games. The next Silent Hill game wouldn't come for another 3 years. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.